Tell you what, I did not choose the quarantine life, but the quarantine life has apparently chosen me once again. Let's get into today's lesson, since it's like the only sense of normalcy I have in this crazy era in which we live. Speaking of crazy eras, let's go back to the election of 1800. Now, you'll remember we talked about the election of 1800 in the last episode that we did. You can check that up in the cards, when we discussed how John Adams was our first one-term president here in the United States. He lost that election to the Democratic Republican candidate, Thomas Jefferson. Now, if you remember, went into like this crazy runoff where 36 ballots later, they finally elect Thomas Jefferson to be president. The election of 1800 definitely showed that political divide. It showed how divided our country was. Pretty much if you lived along the coast in the cities and you were of the more educated stock of people here in the United States at this time, you were probably a Federalist. You probably favored a strong central government that was operated by other college-educated, well-off, well-to-do people. However, there was another side to the country. They lived closer to the frontier. They lived down in the South, and these were small landowners. These were farmers. These were people that were likely first or second generation immigrants, and they were your Democratic Republicans. And the Democratic Republicans, in a narrow margin, were able to elect Thomas Jefferson to be the president of the United States of America. John Adams refused to attend the inauguration of Thomas Jefferson after bitterly losing to him on such a narrow margin in the election of 1800. Thomas Jefferson was the first president to be inaugurated in our nation's new capital. It was still under construction at the time, but he was inaugurated in Washington, D.C., like every other president after him. And despite being a member of the Democratic Republicans and standing against guys like Alexander Hamilton and even at times George Washington, believe it or not, how do you stand up against George Washington? Despite being against those guys from time to time, Thomas Jefferson truly sought to unite the politics of the United States of America around a few central ideas. However, there were some Federalist things that he wanted to definitely get rid of once he was in office. In fact, in his inaugural address, President Thomas Jefferson tried to heal this divide by telling all the people in attendance that day, and everyone in history as we read it, that we are all Federalists and we are all Democratic Republicans because we are all Americans. However, Thomas Jefferson certainly had a huge project in front of him if he truly wanted to unite the political factions that had formed against George Washington's advice here in the United States of America at this time. Another thing that's interesting about the election of 1800 is it's the first shift of political power within the United States that we see in our history. Thomas Jefferson is going to be following President John Adams, who is very much a Federalist, and he enacted and worked on behalf of many of the Federalist policies. And then obviously the president before John Adams was George Washington, and while he did not claim either political party, if you look back in history, you certainly see George Washington, while he's president, siding with Alexander Hamilton and many other Federalist policies at the time. It kind of makes sense too. If the Federalists favor a strong central government and you're the leader of a new country, you definitely want to show that you are in control of the things that are happening in that nation. So when the Whiskey Rebellion shows up, we need a strong central government and a large army to deal with that. And George Washington definitely leaned that way while he was in office. So the election of 1800 brings in Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican who wants to shift things away from the Federalist leanings of the past and move towards a more Democratic Republican future. What that looked like to Jefferson was an agrarian country, a country that could provide for itself. It didn't get involved in outside affairs. He didn't want to have a manufacturing and industrial powerhouse like he saw during his time in France and in England. And he had a very specific idea of how that should look. Unfortunately though, you can have as specific an idea as you want in life, but if the people around you don't share that vision, then it's going to be very hard to bring your ideas to life. That was a battle that Thomas Jefferson faced as president, but let's look at some of the things that he did. In looking at what Thomas Jefferson accomplished, we need to look at how he ran for president. He ran for president as the everyman, everyday candidate. Even as president of the United States, he chose to dispense with a lot of the formalities that had become custom under George Washington and John Adams. He really wanted people to see the president of the United States as someone that they could identify with. Thomas Jefferson is the first one to do that here as a Democratic Republican. If you remember back to the last lesson, you remember one of the things that the Democratic Republicans were really upset about, one of the things they actually sought to enact legislation against was legislation that was passed underneath John Adams and his Federalist friends in Congress, and that was the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, if you remember, the Alien Sedition Acts claimed to be in favor of national security while we were in our quasi-war with France. But essentially what it did was it harmed the Republicans who were in the states, because most immigrants ended up becoming Republicans once they were naturalized citizens. Another thing that the Alien Sedition Acts did was it deported and jailed many people unjustly. And a third thing that the Alien and Sedition Acts did was they severely hampered free speech, especially in political newspapers. Now, while this may have had some positive effects, it's still a trampling on individual liberty. These were things that President Jefferson really sought to undo. So what did he do? Well, he decided that he was going to let the Alien and Sedition Acts expire. They had an expiration date, and so he lets them expire. He doesn't renew them, and then he pardons anyone who was jailed under the Alien Sedition Acts, and he actually writes them a personal apology. That shows how vested Thomas Jefferson is in making America accessible to all people, not just the rich and elite. Probably the second most influential thing that he did as a Democratic Republican president was that he appointed Albert Gallatin to be the Secretary of the Treasury. Albert Gallatin sought to cut costs in many areas in order to reverse the national debt that we had racked up during the War for Independence and then under President Washington and President John Adams. And the way that Gallatin and Jefferson sought to cut the federal deficit in half, that's right, they cut the national debt in half. I couldn't even imagine what would happen if a president actually did that today. They cut the national debt in half by enacting policies that saw a reduction in military spending. If you remember, during the quasi-war with France, the Federalists in Congress really beefed up the American military. They really beefed up the American Navy. While this was good and helped us flex our muscles in the high seas against the French and against the English, it certainly was an expensive thing. Thomas Jefferson was in favor of state militias because they were cheaper, and this was one of the ways that he was able to cut spending here, along with Albert Gallatin, his Secretary of the Treasury. And all this also caused him to be able to repeal the whiskey tax, which also made him pretty popular with lots of people, especially on the frontier. A third thing that Thomas Jefferson did that helped to reverse the Federalist practices that were enacted under John Adams was that he repealed the Judiciary Act, or the Judiciary Bill of 1801. If you remember, this was the bill that was passed at the midnight hour, created lots of midnight judges. Many of those midnight judges never even made it to the bench because of this repeal by Thomas Jefferson. He even acted to impeach some judges. The judges that were impeached by Jefferson's administration were done so because of their poor character. However, his administration did target and try to impeach a very Federalist Supreme Court justice, and they were unable to do that, which was important because it set a precedent that you could not seek to impeach somebody just because they're politically opposed to you. So that was an important thing that happened against Thomas Jefferson during this time as well. However, Thomas Jefferson didn't just seek to reverse all Federalist policies. There were many Federalist policies that were enacted against his will before he was president that he actually kept around. The National Bank was working pretty well, so he decided to leave it there, even though he was very much opposed to the idea when Alexander Hamilton brought it forth. He also kept a lot of the federal powers and authorities that George Washington and John Adams had accumulated during their times in office too. So while he was very much a Democratic Republican president that reversed a lot of the Federalist surge of the previous 8 to 12 years, we see that Thomas Jefferson still saw the value in some Federalist policy. And this brings us to the first test of the Jefferson administration. It comes from a tiny group of islands off the coast of Northwest Africa called the Barbary States, and international shipping had a huge problem with a group of people called the Barbary Pirates. And the Barbary Pirates would charge a tribute for anyone that was in the Mediterranean, whether they were trade or military, and if you didn't pay the tribute, they would capture your ship, take your cargo, and imprison your crew. Thomas Jefferson refused to pay the tribute to the Barbary Pirates, and so the King of Tripoli declares war on the United States. That's right. They declared war on us. And so Thomas Jefferson said, hey, if it's war you want, it's war you get. I may not have as much funds in the Navy as my predecessors have done, but I put a little bit in there. And he sends out the American Navy under the command of Richard Drake and Stephen Decatur. And these two naval heroes fight valiantly against the Barbary Pirates. The Kingdom of Tripoli declares that they're no longer going to charge tribute to American ships. And we see here that Thomas Jefferson gets a huge win in the foreign diplomacy. It definitely strengthens our reputation abroad with other European countries, showing that we're not going to get pushed around and we're going to stand up for ourselves. So the first part here of Thomas Jefferson's presidency is going pretty well. And as a Democratic Republican president, he's holding true to his values. In the next lesson, we're going to look at some things that really tested what Thomas Jefferson truly believed. I can't wait to go over those with you. Next time, we'll also go from a different angle of this basement here. So there's something to look forward to. Like and subscribe so that you don't miss it. We'll see you later.